Hello everybody, Thersites the Historian here. Today we're going to finish H.G. Wells's treatment of the fall of the Roman Republic by tracing its history from the death of Sulla to the birth of the empire under Octavian. This section of the chapter is far weaker than what came before. In the last video where we touched upon H.G. Wells's work, I commented that his treatment of the period between the Gracchi and Sulla was by far the best thing that I had read from him. Today we're looking at something which is far less high quality. Wells' analysis here is simply not as good as it was for the earlier period. However, it does a great deal to illuminate his thinking, and he makes some interesting, if not quite correct, points. That being said, I would like to make some preliminary remarks on Wells's thought, and also give you some previews into what you can expect from him in this section. He makes a few factual claims which are just simply false. At one point, he says that the Romans had no interest in geography and no knowledge of it. That is completely false. Educated Romans were well versed in Greek, so if the Greeks knew about geography, and they did, then the Romans did too. We do know the Romans had maps. We still have some surviving examples of them. Their maps were not ergonomically correct, but they were depictions of the world which enabled the Romans to get from place to place. So to say they had no knowledge or interest in geography is bizarre. Another thing that's interesting about this chapter is who Wells is and isn't interested in. Typically speaking, Marxist historians, and remember Wells is an avowed Marxist, tend to really focus heavily on the Gracchi, Spartacus, and Catiline when we talk about the late Republic. However, while he does talk about Spartacus some, he mentions Catiline only once and in a negative light, which I found fascinating. There actually was a whole trend of Marxist scholarship in the 60s and 70s where you had at least 3 monographs come out within 10 years talking about Catiline as a hero of the people. But Wells, again, is anything but doctrinaire, and I think that's part of what makes him so fascinating. He just has this weird amalgam of different things which go into his thinking, and it makes his insights pretty unique at times. But also some of the insights he comes up with are a little out there. The person he spends the most time covering in the chapter is probably Crassus. He thinks of Crassus as being the man most typical of this age, and he thinks that, I think, in part because in the earlier section that we read, he sees the late Republic as an age of money, and if you're looking for a man of the age and an age of money, well, it has to be someone who is inherently a money man. He doesn't seem to understand Crassus's background, however, as he talks about him as just being where he was because of his wealth and business connections. I don't think he's aware that Crassus's grandfather was a great orator in Rome and that his family was really well connected. But again, Wells is an amateur, and I think that mistake is forgivable. I also note that when he cites Plutarch, he tends to do so fairly uncritically. Earlier, I forgot to note this in the last part, but he accepts the idea that Marius is a man of humble origins, which he could not have possibly been. He does, in a way, accept the great man theory. He talks about the big personalities, but he tries to push back against it, but I don't think his knowledge of the Republic was deep enough to allow him to really do that, to really talk about institutions on a deep level, or to talk about, say, prosopography or something of that nature. So he kind of has a little bit of a desire to do something without the ability to execute, and I think that that comes through as a kind of frustration, and maybe that's why this section as a whole is not as elevated in terms of the prose as what came before. He has a very negative portrayal of both Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and in some ways that's a very modern attitude that was ahead of its time. I think it's safe to say that his negativity towards them as warmongers stemmed from his absolute revulsion at the bloodshed of World War I. This was, of course, written in 1920. His views have not become dominant, but there are modern purveyors of these views, especially towards Caesar. However, the people who dislike Caesar today do so for much different reasons than Wells. Wells seems to see him as a fairly petty man who was still interested in females at the age of 54 and he finds that weird for some reason. But he's not all that bothered by Caesar's genocide in Gaul, which is the reason why a lot of modern people find Caesar to be revolting. So I just find that fascinating. Wells has some very Victorian notions of sexual morality, even though he's very forward-thinking in a lot of other ways. He also talks about some strange things from a racial perspective. He attributes to Aryans innate traits. He talks about the Aryanness of the Romans being lost over time, and just some really weird stuff like that that doesn't make any sense in today's world. He also talks about the Neanderthals as savage brutes. This was in an earlier part of the chapter. I forgot to mention it last time, though. And that, of course, is not in line with modern scientific thinking on the nature of the Neanderthals. They seem to have been much more balanced in terms of their lifestyle, much more like Homo sapiens, if not even a little less violent. And that's based on a pretty limited pool of evidence. So that, of course, is evolving and very much a matter of opinion. But certainly the idea that Neanderthals were brutal and stupid is completely out the window at this point. He also has a very limited knowledge of the steppes. When he talks about Crassus's eastern campaigns, he effectively says that the Parthians and all of the other groups on the steppe who practice nomadism are inseparable from one another, and that all of the Hellenization brought about by Alexander had been undone by this sort of undifferentiated mass on the steppes which just swirls around. It's a very weird notion, and I think it denotes a real lack of knowledge on his part. It also makes me very curious what he'll say about the Mongols later on. Let's see, he has a very rosy portrait of Octavian Augustus. He thinks that he was actually asked to rule, and he was forced to stay in office. He apparently doesn't realize that Octavian stage managed his rise to power, at least his formalization as princeps. And he also doesn't seem to realize that Octavian appointed half the Senate before they begged him to remain in power. Very weird take on Octavian, and oddly idealistic considering that he was bemoaning the fall of the Republic. He also has a very positive portrayal of Cicero, of all people. He says that Cicero was without ego, and that his writings make him accessible, which makes me wonder if Wells actually read any Cicero, because Cicero was nothing if not egotistical. His writings are a nonstop whine fest about his feelings and about Pompey not returning his unrequited man crush and stuff like that. So odd take on Cicero. Also, he says Cicero had principle, but Cicero defended a lot of manifestly guilty people. Cicero was in many ways the Saul Goodman of the Roman Republic. It's just a bizarre take on his part, Wells's, I mean. Although one that is shared by a lot of people in classics even to this day for whatever reason. I guess it's worth noting that many people in classics today don't really know a lot of history. They just know the language and they've read some sources. All right, let's see, what else is here? Oh yeah, he talks about Eastern despotism, Eastern absolutism, Western hardiness, some old stereotypes that were bandied about pretty loosely. He also has a very high opinion of Christianity as a unifying factor and says that it provided the missing ingredient that caused the Republic to fall, which is a bizarre take given that Christianity emerged as a major unifying factor supposedly only after the empire had existed for a long period of time and after the empire was well past its prime. So what kept it together before that? He doesn't really answer that. He seems to imply the legions, but the legions were still around. Christianity didn't give people such a great feeling of brotherhood that they could disband the legions. So it's all very weird. I think he's just trying to push back against the Gibbon school of thought that Christianity undermined the moral fabric of Rome. But he goes on and on about the need for a unifying kind of ideology to bind people together. It's not a very good case that he makes. He makes a reasonable case for the idea of the need to have something like that, but he doesn't explain at all how Christianity fulfills that. So not a great take on that. There are plenty of other people who have covered that and done a much better job. What else? So in general, the takeaway that I have is that this is Wells at his most 1920. You have this general feel of modern science, but some of the science isn't valid anymore, like as I mentioned with the Neanderthals and the whole Aryan innate trait thing. And that's mixed together with an amalgam of revolutionary idealism, a concern for the common people, Victorian sexual attitudes, and what can only be described as Britishness, which combine to create the chaotic, contradictory, fascinating, and enthralling mental world of H.G. Wells. It's a real witch's brew of different elements, but I think that it came together to create a really creative mind. And without these kind of internal contradictions, I'm not sure that H.G. Wells could have been the great fiction writer that he was. Anyhow, those are just my ramblings. Now let's get on to H.G. Wells's ramblings. Political life in Italy was not so much tranquilized as stunned by the massacres and confiscations of Marius and Sulla. The scale upon which this history is planned will not permit us to tell here of the great adventurers who, relying more and more on the support of the legions, presently began to scheme and intrigue again for dictatorial power in Rome. In 73 BC, all Italy was terrified by a rising of the slaves, and particularly of the gladiators, led by a gladiator from Thessaly, Spartacus. He and 70 others had fled from a gladiatorial farm at Capua. Similar risings had already occurred in Sicily. The forces under Spartacus necessarily became a miscellaneous band drawn from east and west, without any common idea except the idea of dispersing and getting home. Nevertheless, he held out in southern Italy for 2 years, using the then apparently extinct crater of Vesuvius for a time as a natural fortress. The Italians, for all their love of gladiatorial display, failed to appreciate this conversion of the whole country into an arena, this bringing of the gladiatorial sword to the door, and when at last Spartacus was overthrown, their terror changed to frantic cruelty. 6,000 of his captured followers were crucified, long miles of nailed and drooping victims along the Appian Way. Here we cannot deal at any length with Lucullus, who invaded Pontus and fought Mithridates, and brought the cultivated cherry tree to Europe, nor can we tell how ingeniously Pompey the Great stole the triumph and most of the prestige Lucullus had won in Armenia beyond Pontus. Lucullus, like Sulla, retired into an opulent private life, but with more elegance and with a more gracious end. We cannot relate in any detail how Julius Caesar accumulated reputation in the West by conquering Gaul, defeating the German tribes upon the Rhine, and pushing a punitive raid across the Strait of Dover into Britain. More and more important grow the legions. Less and less significant are the Senate and assemblies of Rome. But there is a certain grim humor about the story of Crassus that we cannot altogether neglect. This Crassus was a great moneylender and forestaller. He was a typical man of the new equestrian type, the social equivalent of a modern munition profiteer. He first grew rich by buying up the property of those proscribed by Sulla. His earliest exploits in the field were against Spartacus, whom finally he crushed by great payments and exertions after a prolonged and expensive campaign. He then, as the outcome of complicated bargains, secured the command in the east and prepared to emulate the glories of Lucullus, who had pushed east from Pergamon and Bithynia into Pontus, and of Pompey, who had completed the looting of Armenia. His experiences served to demonstrate the gross ignorance with which the Romans were conducting their affairs at that time. He crossed the Euphrates expecting to find in Persia another Hellenized kingdom like Pontus, but as we have already intimated, the great reservoirs of nomadic peoples that stretched round from the Danube across Russia and the Central Asia had been raining back into the lands between the Caspian Sea and the Indus that Alexander had conquered for Hellenism. Crassus found himself against the Scythian again, against mobile tribes of horsemen led by a monarch in Median costume. The particular variety of Scythian he encountered was called the Parthian. It is possible that in the Parthians a Mongolian, Turanian element was now mingled with the Aryan strain. But the campaign of Crassus beyond the Euphrates is curiously like the campaign of Darius beyond the Danube. There is the same heavy thrusting of an infantry force against elusive light horsemen. But Crassus was less quick than Darius to realize the need of withdrawal, and the Parthians were better bowmen than the Scythians Darius met. They seem to have had some sort of noisy projectile of unusual strength and force, something that was different from an ordinary arrow. This bow, says Professor J. L. Myers, was probably the composite bow, so called because it is made of several plates, 5 or so, of horn, like the springs of a carriage. It discharges a high-speed arrow with a twang. This was the bow the Mongols used. This composite bow, it was not a long bow, was quite old in human experience. It was the bow of Odysseus. The Assyrians had it in a modified form. It went out in Greece, but it survived as the Mongol bow. It was quite short, very stiff to pull, with a flat trajectory, a remarkable range, and a great noise. See Homer's reference to the twang of the bow. It went out in the Mediterranean because the climate was not good for it, and because there were insufficient animals to supply the horn. The campaign culminated in that 2 days massacre of the hot, thirsty, hungry, and weary Roman legions, which is known as the Battle of Carrhae, 53 BC. They toiled through the sand, charging an enemy who always evaded their charge, and rode round them and shot them to pieces. 20,000 of them were killed, and 10,000 marched on eastward as prisoners into slavery in Iran. What became of Crassus is not clearly known. There is a story, probably invented for our moral benefit and suggested by his usuries, that he fell alive into the hands of the Parthians and was killed by having molten gold poured down his throat. But this disaster has a very great significance indeed to our general history of mankind. It serves to remind us that from the Rhine to the Euphrates, all along the north of the Alps and the Danube and Black Sea, stretched one continuous cloud of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, whom the statecraft of imperial Rome was never able to pacify and civilize, nor her military science subdue. We have already called attention to a map showing how the Second Babylonian Empire, the Chaldean Empire, lay like a lamb in the embrace of the Median power. In exactly the same way, the Roman Empire lay like a lamb in the embrace of this great crescent of outer barbarians. Not only was Rome never able to thrust back or assimilate that superincumbent crescent, but she was never able to organize the Mediterranean Sea into a secure and orderly system of communication between one part of her empire and another. Quite unknown as yet to Rome, the Mongolian tribes from northeastern Asia, the Huns, and their kin, walled back and driven out from China by the Xi and Han dynasties, were drifting and pressing westward, mixing with the Parthians, the Scythians, the Teutons, and the like, or driving them before them. Never at any time did the Romans succeed in pushing their empire beyond Mesopotamia, and upon Mesopotamia their hold was never very secure. Before the close of the Republic, that power of assimilation, which had been the secret of their success, was giving way to patriotic exclusiveness and patriotic greed. Rome plundered and destroyed Asia Minor and Babylonia, which were the necessary basis for an eastward expansion to India, just as she had destroyed and looted Carthage, and so had no foothold for extension into Africa, and just as she had destroyed Corinth and so cut herself off from an easy way into the heart of Greece. Western European writers, impressed by the fact that later on Rome Romanized and civilized Gaul and South Britain, and restored the scene of her earlier devastations in Spain to prosperity, are apt to ignore that over far greater areas to the south and east, her influence was to weaken and so restore to barbarism the far wider conquest of Hellenic civilization. But among the politicians of Italy in the 1st century BC, there were no maps of Germany and Russia, Africa and Central Asia, and no sufficient intelligence to study them had they existed. Rome never developed the fine curiosities that sent Hanno and the sailors of Pharaoh Necho down the coast of Africa. When in the 1st century BC the emissaries of the Han dynasty reached the eastern shores of the Caspian Sea, they found only stories of a civilization that had receded. The memory of Alexander still lived in these lands, but of Rome men only knew that Pompey had come to the western shores of the Caspian and gone away again, and that Crassus had been destroyed. Rome was preoccupied at home. What mental energy remained over in the Roman citizen from the attempt to grow personally rich and keep personally safe was intent upon the stratagems and strokes and counterstrokes of the various adventurers who were now manifestly grappling for the supreme power. It is the custom of historians to treat these struggles with extreme respect. In particular, the figure of Julius Caesar is set up as if it were a star of culminating brightness and importance in the history of mankind. Yet a dispassionate consideration of the known facts fails altogether to justify this demigod theory of Caesar. Not even that precipitate wrecker of splendid possibilities, Alexander the Great, has been so magnified and dressed up for the admiration of careless and uncritical readers. There is a type of scholar who, to be plain, sits and, with the merest scraps of justification or with no justification at all, invents marvelous world policies for the more conspicuous figures in history. We are told that Alexander planned the conquest of Carthage and Rome and the complete subjugation of India, and that only his death shattered these schemes. What we know for certain is that he conquered the Persian Empire and never went far beyond its boundaries, and that when he was supposed to be making these vast and noble plans, he was in fact indulging in such monstrous antics as his mourning for his favorite Hephaestion, and as his main occupation he was drinking himself to death. So too, Julius Caesar is credited with the intention of doing just that one not impossible thing which would have secured the Roman Empire from its ultimate collapse, namely the systemic conquest and civilization of Europe as far as the Baltic and the Dnieper. He was to have marched upon Germany, says Plutarch, through Parthia and Scythia, round the north of the Caspian and Black Seas. Yet the fact we have to reconcile with this wise and magnificent project is that at the crest of his power, Caesar, already a bald middle-aged man, past the graces and hot impulses of youthful love, spent the better part of a year in Egypt, feasting and entertaining himself in amorous pleasantries with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra, and afterwards he brought her with him to Rome, where her influence over him was bitterly resented. Such complications with a woman mark the elderly sensualist or sentimentalist. He was 54 at the commencement of the affair, rather than the master ruler of men. On the side of the Superman idea of Caesar, we have to count a bust in the Naples Museum. It represents a fine and intellectual face, very noble in its expression, and we can couple with that the story that his head, even at birth, was unusually large and finely formed. But there is really no satisfying evidence that this well-known bust does represent Caesar, and it is hard to reconcile its austere serenity with the reputation for violent impulse and disorderliness that clung to him. Other busts of quite different man are also, with more probability, ascribed to him. There can be little doubt that he was a dissolute and extravagant young man. The scandals cluster thick about his sojourn in Bithynia, whither he fled from Sulla. He was the associate of the reprobate Clodius and the conspirator Catiline, and there is nothing in his political career to suggest any aim higher or remoter than his own advancement to power and all the personal glory and indulgence that power makes possible. We will not attempt to tell here of the turns and devices of his career. Although he was of an old patrician family, he came into politics as the brilliant darling of the people. He spent great sums and incurred heavy debts to provide public festivals on the most lavish scale. He opposed the tradition of Sulla and cherished the memory of Marius, who was his uncle by marriage. For a time he worked in conjunction with Crassus and Pompey, but after the death of Crassus, he and Pompey came into conflict. By 49 BC, he and Pompey with their legions, he from the west and Pompey from the east, were fighting openly for predominance in the Roman state. He had broken the law by bringing his legions across the Rubicon, which was the boundary between his command and Italy proper. At the Battle of Pharsalus in Thessaly, 48 BC, Pompey was routed, and fleeing to Egypt was murdered, leaving Caesar more master of the Roman world than ever Sulla had been. He was then created dictator for 10 years in 46 BC, and early in 45 BC, he was made dictator for life. This was monarchy, if not hereditary monarchy. It was at least electoral life monarchy. It was unlimited opportunity to do his best for the world, and by the spirit and quality of his use of this dictatorial power during these 4 years, we are bound to judge him. A certain reorganization of local administration he effected, and he seems to have taken up what was a fairly obvious necessity of the times, a project for the restoration of the 2 murdered seaports of Corinth and Carthage, whose destruction had wrecked the sea life of the Mediterranean. But much more evident was the influence of Cleopatra in Egypt upon his mind. Like Alexander before him, his head seems to have been turned by the king-god tradition, assisted no doubt in his case by the adulation of that charming hereditary goddess Cleopatra. We find evidence of exactly that same conflict upon the score of divine pretensions between him and his personal friends that we have already recorded in the case of Alexander. So far as the Hellenized East was concerned, the paying of divine honors to rulers was a familiar idea, but it was still repulsive to the lingering Arianism of Rome. Antony, who had been his second in command at Pharsalus, was one of the chief of his flatterers. Plutarch describes a scene at the public games in which Antony tried to force a crown upon Caesar, which Caesar, after a little coyness and in the face of the manifest displeasure of the crowd, refused. But he had adopted the ivory scepter and throne, which were the traditional insignia of the gods in the opening pompa of the arena, and his statue was set up in a temple with an inscription, "To the unconquerable God." Priests even were appointed for his godhead. These things are not symptoms of great-mindedness, but of a common man's megalomania. Caesar's record of vulgar scheming for the tawdriest mockeries of personal worship is a silly and shameful record. It is incompatible with the idea that he was a wise and wonderful Superman setting the world to rights. Finally, 44 BC, he was assassinated by a group of his own friends and supporters, to whom these divine aspirations had become intolerable. He was beset in the Senate and stabbed in 23 places, dying at the foot of the statue of his fallen rival, Pompey the Great. The scene marks the complete demoralization of the old Roman governing body. Brutus, the ringleader of the murderers, would have addressed the senators, but confronted by this crisis, they were scuttling off in every direction. For the best part of a day, Rome did not know what to make of this event. The murderers marched about with their bloody weapons through an undecided city, with no one gainsaying them, and only a few joining them. Then public opinion turned against them. Some of their houses were attacked, and they had to hide and fly for their lives. But the trend of things was overwhelmingly towards monarchy. For 13 years more, the struggle of personalities went on. One single man is to be noted as inspired by broad ideals and an ambition not entirely egoistic: Cicero. He was a man of modest origin, whose eloquence and literary power had won him a prominent place in the Senate. He was a little tainted by the abusive tradition of Demosthenes, nevertheless he stands out, a noble and pathetically ineffective figure, pleading with the now utterly degenerate, base, and cowardly Senate for the high ideals of the Republic. He was a writer of great care and distinction, and the orations and private letters he has left us make him one of the most real and living figures of this period to the modern reader. He was proscribed and killed in 43 BC, the year after the murder of Julius Caesar, and his head and hands were nailed up in the Roman Forum. Octavian, who became at last the monarch of Rome, seems to have made an effort to save Cicero. That murder was certainly not his crime. Here we cannot trace out the tangle of alliances and betrayals that ended in the ascendancy of this Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. The fate of the chief figures is interwoven with that of Cleopatra. After the death of Caesar, she set herself to capture the emotions and vanity of Antony, a much younger man than Caesar, with whom she was probably already acquainted. For a time, Octavian and Antony, and a third figure, Lepidus, divided the Roman world just as Caesar and Pompey had divided it before their final conflict. Octavian took the hardier west and consolidated his power. Antony had the more gorgeous east, and Cleopatra. To Lepidus fell that picked bone, Carthaginian Africa. He seems to have been a good man of good traditions, set upon the restoration of Carthage rather than upon wealth or personal vanities. The mind of Antony succumbed to those same ancient ideas of divine kingship that had already proved too much for the mental equilibrium of Julius Caesar. In the company of Cleopatra, he gave himself up to love, amusements, and a dream of sensuous glory, until Octavian felt that the time was ripe to end these two Egyptian divinities. In 32 BC, Octavian induced the Senate to depose Antony from the command of the East and proceeded to attack him. A great naval battle at Actium, 31 BC, was decided by the unexpected desertion of Cleopatra with 60 ships in the midst of the fight. It is quite impossible for us to decide now whether this was due to premeditated treachery or to the sudden whim of a charming woman. The departure of these ships threw the fleet of Antony into hopeless confusion, which was increased by the headlong flight of this model lover in pursuit. He went off after her in a swift galley without informing his commanders. He left his followers to fight and die as they thought fit, and for a time they were incredulous that he had gone. The subsequent encounter of the two lovers and their reconciliation is a matter for ironical speculation on the part of Plutarch. Octavian's net closed slowly around his rival. It is not improbable that there was some sort of understanding between Octavian and Cleopatra, as perhaps in the time of Julius Caesar there may have been between the queen and Antony. Antony gave way to much mournful posturing, varied by love scenes during this last stage of his little drama. For a time he posed as an imitator of the cynic Timon, as one who had lost all faith in mankind, though one may think that his deserted sailors at Actium had better reason for such an attitude. Finally, he found himself in Cleopatra besieged by Octavian in Alexandria. There were some sallies and minor successes, and Antony was loud with challenges to Octavian to decide the matter by personal combat. Being led to believe that Cleopatra had committed suicide, this star of romance stabbed himself, but so ineffectually as to die lingeringly, and he was carried off to expire in her presence, 30 BC. Plutarch's account of Antony, which was derived very largely from witnesses who had seen and known him, describes him of heroic mold. He is compared to the demigod Hercules, from whom indeed he claimed descent, and also to the Indian Bacchus. There is a disgusting but illuminating description of a scene in the Senate when he attempted to speak while drunk, and was overtaken by one of the least dignified concomitants of intoxication. For a little while, Cleopatra still clung to life, and perhaps to the hope that she might reduce Octavian to the same divine role that had already been played by Julius Caesar and Antony. She had an interview with Octavian in which she presented herself as beauty in distress and very lightly clad. But when it became manifest that Octavian lacked the godlike spark, and that his care for her comfort and welfare was dictated chiefly by his desire to exhibit her in a triumphal procession through the streets of Rome, she committed suicide. An asp was smuggled to her past the Roman sentries, concealed in a basket of figs, and by its fangs she died. Octavian seems to have been almost entirely free from the divine aspirations of Julius Caesar and Antony. He was neither god nor romantic hero. He was a man. He was a man of far greater breadth and capacity than any other player in this last act of the Republican drama in Rome. All things considered, he was perhaps the best thing that could have happened to Rome at that time. He voluntarily resigned the extraordinary powers which he had held since 43, and to quote his own words, handed over the Republic to the control of the Senate and people of Rome. The old constitutional machinery was once more set in motion. The Senate, assembly, and magistrates resumed their functions, and Octavian himself was hailed as the restorer of the Commonwealth and the champion of freedom. It was not so easy to determine what relation he himself, the actual master of the Roman world, should occupy towards this revived republic. His abdication, in any real sense of the word, would have simply thrown everything back into confusion. The interest of peace and order required that he should retain at least a substantial part of his authority, and this object was in fact accomplished, and the rule of the emperors founded in a manner which has no parallel in history. Any revival of the kingly title was out of the question, and Octavian himself expressly refused a dictatorship. Nor was any new office created or any new official title invented for his benefit, but by Senate and people he was invested according to the old constitutional forms with certain powers, as many citizens had been before him, and so took his place by the side of the lawfully appointed magistrates of the Republic, only to mark his preeminent dignity as the first of them all. The Senate decreed that he should take as an additional cognomen that of Augustus, while in common parlance he was henceforth styled princeps, a simple title of courtesy familiar to republican usage and conveying no other idea than that of a recognized primacy and precedence over his fellow citizens. The ideal sketched by Cicero in his De Republica of a constitutional president of a free republic was apparently realized, but only in appearance. For, in fact, the special prerogatives conferred upon Octavian gave him back in substance the autocratic authority he had resigned, and as between the restored republic and its new princeps, the balance of power was overwhelmingly on the side of the latter. In this manner it was that Roman republicanism ended in a princeps or ruling prince, and the first great experiment in a self-governing community on a scale larger than that of a tribe or city collapsed and failed. The essence of its failure was that it could not sustain unity. In its early stages its citizens, both patrician and plebeian, had a certain tradition of justice and good faith, and of the loyalty of all citizens to the law, and of the goodness of the law for all citizens. It clung to this idea of the importance of the law and of law-abidingness nearly into the 1st century BC. But the unforeseen invention and development of money, the temptations and disruptions of imperial expansion, the entanglement of electoral methods, weakened and swamped this tradition by presenting old issues in new disguises, under which the judgment did not recognize them, and by enabling men to be loyal to the professions of citizenship and disloyal to its spirit. The bond of the Roman people had always been a moral rather than a religious bond. Their religion was sacrificial and superstitious. It embodied no such great ideas of a divine leader and of a sacred mission as Judaism was developing. As the idea of citizenship failed and faded before the new occasions, there remained no inner, that is to say real, unity in the system at all. Every man tended more and more to do what was right in his own eyes. Under such conditions, there was no choice between chaos and a return to monarchy, to the acceptance of some chosen individual as the one unifying will in the state. Of course, in that return, there is always hidden the expectation that the monarch will become, as it were, magic, will cease to be merely a petty human being, and will think and feel as something greater and more noble, as indeed a state personage. And, of course, monarchy invariably fails to satisfy that expectation. We shall glance at the extent of this failure in the brief review we are to presently make of the emperors of Rome. We shall find at least one of the more constructive of these emperors, Constantine the Great, conscious of his own inadequacy as a unifying power, turning to the faith, the organization, and teaching network of one of the new religious movements in the empire, to supply just that permeating and correlating factor in men's minds that was so manifestly wanting. With Caesar, the civilization of Europe and Western Asia went back to monarchy, and through monarchy, assisted presently by organized Christianity, It sought to achieve peace, righteousness, happiness, and world order for close upon 18 centuries. Then, almost suddenly, it began reverting to republicanism, first in one country and then in another, and assisted by the new powers of printing and the press and of organized general education, and by the universalist religious ideas in which the world had been soaked for generations. It seems now to have resumed again the effort to create a republican world state and a worldwide scheme of economic righteousness which the Romans had made so prematurely and in which they had so utterly and disastrously failed. Certain conditions we are now beginning to perceive are absolutely necessary to such a creation, conditions which it is inconceivable that any pre-Christian Roman could have regarded as possible. We may still think that the attainment of these conditions a vastly laborious and difficult and uncertain undertaking, but we understand that the attempt must be made because no other prospect before us gives even a promise of happiness or self-respect or preservation of our kind. The first of these conditions is that there should be a common political idea in the minds of all men, an idea of the state thought of as the personal possession of each individual and as the backbone fact of his scheme of duties. In the early days of Rome, when it was a little visible state, 20 miles square, such notions could be and were developed in children in their homes, and by what they saw and heard of the political lives of their fathers. But in a larger country such as Rome had already become before the war with Pyrrhus, there was a need of an organized teaching of the history, of the main laws, and of the general intentions of the state towards everyone if this moral unity was to be maintained. But the need was never realized, and no attempt at any such teaching was ever made. At the time it could not have been made. It is inconceivable that it could have been made. The knowledge was not there, and there existed no class from which the needed teachers could be drawn, and no conception of an organization for any such systemic moral and intellectual training as the teaching organization of Christianity, with its creeds and catechisms and sermons and confirmations, presently supplied. Moreover, we know nowadays that even a universal education of this sort supplies only the basis for a healthy republican state. Next to education, there must come abundant, prompt, and truthful information of what is going on in the state, and frank and free discussion of the issues of the time. Even nowadays, these functions are performed only very imperfectly and badly by the press we have, and by our publicists and politicians. But badly though it is done, the thing is done. And the fact that it is done at all argues that it may ultimately be done well. In the Roman state, it was not even attempted. The Roman citizen got his political facts from rumor and the occasional orator. He stood wedged in the forum, imperfectly hearing a distant speaker. He probably misconceived every issue upon which he voted. And of the monstrous ineffectiveness of the Roman voting system we have already written. Unable to surmount or remove these obstacles to a sane and effective popular government, the political instincts of the Roman mind turned towards monarchy. But it was not monarchy of the later European type, not hereditary monarchy, which was now installed in Rome. The princeps was really like an American wartime president, but he was elected not for 4 years, but for life. He was able to appoint senators instead of being restrained by an elected Senate, and with a rabble popular meeting in the place of the House of Representatives. He was also Pontifex Maximus, chief of the sacrificial priest, a function unknown at Washington. And in practice it became usual for him to designate and train his successor, and to select for that honor a son or an adopted son or a near relation he could trust. The power of the princeps was in itself enormous to entrust to the hands of a single man, without any adequate checks. But it was further enhanced by the tradition of monarch worship, which had now spread out from Egypt over the entire Hellenized East, and which was coming to Rome in the head of every Oriental slave and immigrant. By natural and imperceptible degrees, the idea of the God Emperor came to dominate the whole Romanized world. Only one thing presently remained to remind the God Emperor that he was mortal, and that was the army. The god emperor was never safe upon the Olympus of the Palatine Hill at Rome. He was only secure while he was the beloved captain of his legions. And as a consequence, only the hard-working emperors who kept their legions active and in close touch with themselves had long reigns. The sword overhung the emperor and spurred him to incessant activity. If he left things to his generals, one of these generals presently replaced him. This spur was perhaps the redeeming feature of the Roman imperial system. In the greater, compacter, and securer empire of China, there was not the same need of legions, and so there was not the same swift end for lazy or dissipated or juvenile monarchs that overtook such types in Rome.